Dick Rauscher here. Today we're going to be talking about Nugget 245, Time to Take Off the Gloves. This article has an awful lot of information in it that I think is really important. Obviously I can't go through all of it today or you'd be here for an hour. But I do have 5 of the big ideas in the article that I really think are worth talking about today. I wrote this article because of the global instability that we're beginning to see. Threats of global climate change, a slowing global economy. We're looking at just a lot of tipping points in the world right now, and we need good leadership. If ever our political system needed to be functioning effectively and competently, now is the time. So looking at all the instability around the world and the never-ending wars that we're in, I thought it was time to really take a look at what are some of the things that need fixing in our system as we move into the 2016 elections. What do we need to stay focused on as voters? So we're going to take a look at some of the primary ideas in the article. These are only a few of them, but I tried to pick out the ones that I thought were a little more important. Okay, big idea number 1. We are awash in our political system today with ideologies. Now, it's helpful to have an idea. I mean, if you're a politician, you want to have some ideas when you go into office. The problem is if you go in with ideological beliefs that are too rigid, and we're seeing this all through our political system right now, then what happens is that our ideas are presented as absolute truth. In other words, we need to be absolutely right, and there is no compromise whatsoever in our position. This kind of thinking is very dangerous because it's basically kind of a petulant adolescent thinking process. And it's not a process that we want to see in our politicians. Our politicians need to be flexible, they need to be wise, they need to be willing to compromise, okay? So, big idea number 1 is ideology. Big idea number 2, free market capitalism. Now, free market capitalism has done a great job for us, okay? It kind of started with the steam engine, and it's created our entire Western culture. It's created most of what we know in the modern world today, okay? But we have a problem. Free market capitalism is based on greed, and it is no longer working. The money has been flowing up to the ultra wealthy, to the 1%, and we're seeing a lot of abuse in the system, in the economic system. Big money is forcing deregulation when we should be going in the opposite direction. There is no way that greed is self-regulating. And anyone who tells us that deregulation is not needed, that we can make the system work, don't believe them. No one in history has ever really put a handle on greed. The only way you have any handle on this free market capitalism is if we have feedback, and we don't have any negative feedback. That's what the regulations do. In other words, when the greed starts to get pushed too far, then the regulations push back and they say, no, we're not going to allow that. There's a limit of greed that's healthy because we all want to get ahead. But when we start to amass too much greed, kind of like the 1% right now, then what we're doing is we're financing deregulation, and we're killing all the feedback that would bring our system into balance. That's an important issue, and it really needs to be looked at in this political process. Okay, next big idea. Now, big money. Big money in itself is not necessarily bad. Where big money becomes a real problem, however, is when it begins to influence, for example, deregulation, but more importantly, it begins to influence the media and our politicians. And what I mean by that is the media can afford to put out a high level of repetition of information that generates fear and doubt in the voter. Why is that dangerous? Because when we're driven by fear and confused by doubt, it's pretty normal for the average voter to kind of throw their hands in the air and say, I don't know what's true anymore anyway, so why bother voting? Now, why do I see this as a really big idea and an important one that we need to take a look at? Is that right now we only have 50% of the American voter going to the polls. Only 50% of Americans are voting. And I think it's because we're just so overwhelmed with the doubt and the fears and all the media repetition that's coming to us financed by big money. It means, and here's the danger, it means the politicians only have to influence 25% of the American population. Think about that. They only have to get their message to 25% of the voters, and they control our nation. Totally. Pretty scary stuff when you think about it. So, one of the big ideas in the article is when you are hearing fear, when you're hearing doubt, it's probably being financed by big money, and be very careful of what you buy into, because we can't afford to shut down our focus on some of the problems that are going on because we're being controlled by fear and doubt. Okay, next big idea, and there's a whole bunch of these in the article. I'll just pick out one or two here because they are important. When you're overwhelmed and kind of at a point of throwing your hand in the air because you don't know who to believe or what to believe, what my recommendation is, go back to common sense. For example, and I have a whole list of common sense ideas in the article. Compromise. Let's take that one as a real simple one. If we're going to have a modern system, then our modern system in democracy is always based on compromise. In other words, there's always truth on both sides of every issue. The politicians get together. They have their beliefs. But what they say is, okay, we're going to try to take some of the truth on this side and some of the truth on this side, and we're going to find our way forward. When you shut down compromise and you absolutely refuse to compromise because you're right, in other words, you're taking your ideology and pouring concrete on it, then you've shut down the whole democratic system. There's no way anybody can move forward. There's no feedback, negative feedback, or an alternate idea. Very, very dangerous in a democracy. In fact, it's probably the most dangerous cancer that we could hope to introduce in a democratic system. Now, here's the issue. It's called dialectical thinking. Very simple. Big word, very simple concept. When someone has an idea or a thesis, what happens is somebody else will immediately come up with an antithesis. That's just the way our brains work, okay? Now, if you take one person and their thesis gets pushed and pushed and pushed, it eventually goes over the edge and it destroys our democratic system because they've got too much power. What we need is to make sure that the antithesis is pushing back and holding the system in balance. And our democratic system right now is getting seriously out of balance because we have people who are kind of petulant adolescent thinkers and they're not compromising. We have to get politicians who are not willing to compromise they have no business being in Washington, and they shouldn't be elected into public office, bottom line. Okay, the last big idea, beware of emotional distractions. We are getting bombarded with all sorts of kind of picayune, mundane things that the media is being paid, and the politicians, to kind of blow it into huge proportion. A really good example is the recent problem with red cups at Starbucks. Okay, now we're in the middle of a major political season. What's getting all the attention? The color of a coffee cup. When you see that kind of thinking and that kind of hoopla in our system, beware. The only thing it's designed to do, it's designed to distract you. It's designed to keep you from really thinking about these common sense ideas, these big issues that we're facing that need to be addressed by wise leaders in Congress. Okay? So, the article is, it's time to take back our power. Basically, our politicians are not kings, they're not queens, they're not royalty, they're not dictators, they're just elected officials, elected politicians. And if we have the wisdom to vote, we have an enormous amount of power to correct the systems and keep the politicians honest. Okay? So, read the article, a lot of good material in it. Basically, it's warning us to be careful of emotional distractions. Don't get caught up in nonsense. Use common sense when you get confused. We need dialectical thinking. We need compromise in our system. Big money is increasing abuse in the system because they're buying the media and the politicians, and they're giving us a steady diet of fear and doubt. Be really careful of that, because that means if we get discouraged, then we give 25% of the voters total control of our nation. And who's behind them? Big money. And what's big money doing? It's almost always based by greed, right? So, free market capitalism, be really careful. It's a good system. It's done some great things, but it has a basic flaw built into it. It's based on greed. And we need regulation, and we need feedback to keep those abuses of our system under control. And finally, the thinking that that politicians take to Washington can't be ideological. It has to be willing to compromise. You can't go in to a democratic system and insist on being absolutely right and then not compromising with anyone. All that does is gridlock the system. Okay? 2016, in my mind, is an extremely important election, and I think we really need to wake up as voters to how we're being manipulated. Okay? You can find the article on the Stony Hill website. Just click on the bottom of the video, and we'll see you down the road. Have a good week.